In Learning Unit 3, we are going to look at payment systems and in particular the various categories of payment as well as paper-based transfers, electronic fund transfers, and payment cards. A payment mechanism is defined as any machinery which facilitates the transmission of money from payer to payee, which bypasses the physical transport and delivery of money. And what this means is when we pay by cash, we have to physically transport and deliver the notes and coins with which we want to make payment. So any mechanism that is able to effect payment from a payer to a payee without actually physically delivering cash is then known as a payment mechanism. A payment system, in turn, is where you have a payment mechanism which then facilitates a standard method of payment through a banking system. So in other words, we use these payment mechanisms to create a system that is accepted in the banking world. And examples of these systems are paper-based transfers. Now remember, paper-based transfers could be anything from a check to a stop order to a traveler's check. Another system of payment is payment cards, and remember, under cards we have different mechanisms of payment. So you have a debit card, you have a credit card, and so on. And then another system is the electronic funds transfer system. And all these systems enable payment to be effected, obviously without it being a cash payment. It facilitates the circulation of money, and it refers to any instruments or procedures that relate to the payment system. The purpose of developing these payment systems was to try and make it more practical and easy to transfer funds, and effectively what it equates to is the different financial institutions, instead of actually physically transferring money from Standard Bank to Nedbank, they simply do an exchange of debits and credits. And I'll explain this in a little bit more detail later. So in South Africa, our payment system is known as the National Payment System, the NPS, and this is governed by the National Payment System Act. As we discovered previously, remember the Reserve Bank oversees all banking transactions, and so of course they also oversee the running and the regulation of the national payment system. And they have sort of a subcommittee or sub-management body that is appointed to assist them in this overseeing function, and this is known as PASA, or the Payments Association of South Africa. Just a very brief overview of the legal foundation for the payment system that we use in South Africa. As I said, the South African Reserve Bank oversees the situation or oversees the regulation of the payment system, and the Reserve Bank is governed by the South African Reserve Bank Act. In turn, there's a National Payments System Act, and that governs the Payment Association of South Africa as well as the PASA Constitution. PASA also has a whole number of policies and position papers which also give guidance in terms of regulation. We also have the Payment Clearinghouse Agreements, as well as the Payment Clearinghouse Clearing Rules, and then in turn there are service level agreements that are concluded between the relevant parties. The different categories of payment are divided into two sort of rough branches. The first one is what we call tangible methods of payment, and the other one is the intangible methods of payment. So tangible meaning we have an instrument that we can touch, see, and feel. And the three different tangible methods of payment are cash payments, paper-based transfers, and card payments. Now, cash, as you know, in South Africa is only recognized as being notes and coins, and is the only a medium of payment that is regarded as legal tender. So if a creditor wants to be difficult, they can insist that you make a cash payment, and they don't have to accept a check payment or a credit card payment or even an EFT. But it is less practical to use cash, especially when you're paying in large sums of money. You don't want to be hauling a duffel bag full of cash around. It's not safe, and it's just cumbersome. And also, when you're wanting to actually effect payment, you have to physically transport the cash to the payee and deliver it. Opposed to that, we have paper-based transfers, which are obviously much more practical because it just involves one piece of paper, for example. And the different types of paper-based transfers are, of course, our checks, and that's what we're going to focus on in this learning unit, as well as bills of exchange, stop orders, debit orders, documentary letters of credit, and traveler's checks. The credit card payments, just card payments in general include credit cards, debit cards, and then check cards. And we'll obviously go into that in a little bit more detail later on. Then the intangible method of payment, the electronic transfer, because there's no documentary proof of payment except for your EFT POP. But what I mean is that you don't have to present a card for payment or present a check for payment. It's done electronically. And examples of electronic transfers are your ATM transfers, your EFT POSs, phone or mobile or internet banking. And what happens here is we say that this is an absolute form of payment because once you've made payment in terms of an EFT, the payment cannot be reversed. Legislation covering payment transactions in South Africa is a bit sketchy. Because there are many transactions that aren't properly regulated by legislation, as is the case in other jurisdictions and other countries. There are, however, certain acts which do protect parties, and one of them is the Bills of Exchange Act. And this is legislation that essentially protects parties in relation to payments that are made by negotiable instruments, for example, checks. So there is a lot of legislation protecting the parties to check payments, and we'll have a look at this in the next theme. The Consumer Protection Act provides a general framework or a general protection to consumers in respect of banking and financial transactions. But remember, it's not designed simply to govern the finance sector and relates to all sorts of industries. What it does do is it requires the bank, who is the supplier of services, to provide copies of contracts to customers free of charge in plain and understandable language. And there are other provisions that also protect the parties to a banking transaction. Similarly, the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act, sometimes known as the ECTA, also provides a general framework for regulating electronic transactions in the financial sector, but again, it also doesn't deal exclusively with electronic banking services. What it does do for the banking industry is it provides for safe and secure environments for conducting electronic transactions, and it also ensures compliance with accepted international technical standards insofar as those electronic transactions are concerned. The Protection of Personal Information Act, the POPI Act as it is more colloquially known, regulates how personal information is processed, and it protects consumers against unlawful access and damage or loss in relation to their personal information. So what it does is it requires responsible parties to be appointed, and they have to secure the integrity and the confidentiality of personal information. And this is done by imposing various measures to safeguard against your risks, and also compelling parties to report any breaches in the access to personal information. So there is some protection which is specific to the banking industry against what we call phishing and other scams. So this is where somebody tries to elicit your bank account details. They send you an email and say, please send us your bank account details and your password. We're from the bank and we're just updating our records. And unfortunately, some people respond to this, and it is just a con artist, and they can then access your bank account and steal your money. Okay, so POPI Act includes some protection against this. It also provides that a party may not disclose somebody's bank account number, either knowingly or recklessly, and if they do, this is an offence and can result in a fine or even up to 10 years in prison or both. And then the last piece of legislation, the National Credit Act, the NCA, applies to credit transactions generally. So, any credit transactions involving the bank, they are then subject to the National Credit Act, and in particular it applies to credit card schemes. One of the benefits of the NCA is that it regulates the maximum interest rates that can be charged on accounts, as well as the charges and fees levied by the banks. Because it obviously applies to the credit transactions, all the provisions relating to credit assessment procedures, details of reckless lending and debt review also apply to all the banking transactions or credit transactions. So what are the potential risks with using paper-based transfers or electronic transfers as opposed to payments by cash? So in the first instance, when we're dealing with a check, for example, as I said to you previously, it's not regarded as legal tender, so a creditor doesn't have to accept payment by check. And nowadays, many suppliers or institutions will not accept checks in payment just as a matter of principle. The reason for this is because of the risks of checks being lost or stolen. And also another problem is that when you submit a check to somebody for payment and they accept payment, they still have to wait to see whether the bank is actually going to pay out on the check or not. So in other words, if I write out a check to pay Joe Soap for something that I bought from him and he accepts the payment and delivers the item to me, when he presents the check to the bank for payment, he's not 100% sure that the check is going to be paid out by the bank, because the bank won't pay out on the check if there are insufficient funds. So that's why we regard a check payment as a conditional payment, because it is still subject to the condition that the bank will pay. Another risk is that the collecting bank is liable for negligence to the true owner of the check. And this is obviously an issue when you are in receipt of a stolen check and you're not aware that it is stolen. But we will deal with this when we deal with checks. And another sort of disadvantage of check payments is that the check limit has been set at 500,000, which means that any payments in excess of 500,000 Rand have to be made using another medium of payment. And in most instances today, that will be in the form of an electronic funds transfer for large amounts of money. The problem with electronic transfers, although they are cheap and they're easy and it's very convenient, and you can obviously transfer larger funds of money or larger amounts of money than 500,000, it is not particularly regulated by legislation, which means that there is limited control and there are risks relating to invalid payments or payments to the incorrect account. And the reason for this is because when the banks receive an instruction to transfer electronically, they will check the account number, but they don't check the account number with the name of the account holder. So there's not this sort of double checking, and so sometimes the payment will be made into the account that you've instructed payment to be made into, but it might be the incorrect account, and the bank does not check this. So this is how you have these erroneous payments happening. The payment system is inadequately secured, and there's often an insufficient audit trail for payment. So, for example, with a check, you have a physical piece of paper that is being delivered from the person who's actually drawing the check. So the drawer delivers the check to the payee, but the payee might then decide to negotiate the check to another party, but there's a physical trail of how the check moves from one party to another, whereas with EFT there isn't this audit trail. And very importantly, the banks accept very little responsibility for possible loss in the case of fraud when you're dealing with EFTs, as opposed to when we're dealing with checks, where the Bills of Exchange Act actually makes sure that the banks accept a fair deal of responsibility in the case of fraud. And then the other disadvantage of an EFT is that once you've effected payment, it's actually difficult to reverse that transaction, to countermand it.